SANDHAN, All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.
Good afternoon. I'm Rajan Barrett from MS University of Baroda, Department of English, and I would like to speak to you today about a topic called Wordsworth and Coleridge, which you have in your history syllabus. I would like to say that here is something that you know about, and you know that here these poets are called the Romantic poets. Now, I think it is important to remember that they do not call themselves romantic. They call themselves modern, but we call them romantic. I think it's also important to look at the word romantic. Where does the word romantic come from? The word romantic comes from two kinds of sources. One is the source called the Roman, which in German means the novel, and the romance, which is what you call the medieval chivalric romance, where the knight keeps fighting for his lady love who's far, far away across, locked up in some castle while he is fighting somewhere far away. Now, this is how we begin talking about what you call the romantic. The romantic and the novel, roman. What is the link between that and the word romantic? We must remember that the first person who uses the word romantic is a person not in England but in Germany, and the name of the person is Wolfgang von Goethe. Goethe writes a novel which is called The Sorrows of Young Werther, and this is perhaps what is called the first romantic novel. Now here in The Sorrows of Young Werther we have people who are extremely moved by what happens to Werther, and all his pains which drive him to commit suicide. The story goes that many people who actually read The Sorrows of Young Werther commit suicide because they identify so much with the emotions of Werther. Now, today we might think that to be romantic is foolish, but at that point of time, people were already bored with something called very structured kind of poetry, very structured kind of living, because the courtly was the most important. What happens over here is that they live and they write in courtly circles. They write with a lot of constraint. And we have Wordsworth and Coleridge who come along, and Wordsworth and Coleridge are two friends who live in the Lake District, which is the northern part of England, very close to Scotland. Now, what is interesting about Wordsworth and Coleridge is that both these people, as young people, are taken up by another person who is an Enlightenment figure, and the name of the person is Rousseau. Now, Rousseau is also called the father of the French Revolution. And one of the things that Rousseau is responsible for is something called the idea of the noble savage. When we talk about savagery, we normally look down on the savage. But Rousseau says that the savage is a noble being because he is uncorrupted by society. Now, with this and these few little links that we have, these are some of the influences where Wordsworth and Coleridge are people who are thinking about writing, who are young people, who are also aristocrats, just like Philip, Sidney, and Spenser, and many other people. But what happens is they are people who start looking at the world differently. Rousseau, as he inspires the French Revolution, is what you call a person who is talking about something called republicanism. We have our Republic Day, and we're talking about democracy, equality, liberty, and fraternity, which were the slogans of what you call the French Revolution. We can never talk about Rousseau, of Wordsworth and Coleridge, without talking about Rousseau and the French Revolution. We must remember that the whole idea of being a revolutionary is something that was very important for all these people called the Romantics. We must remember also that Romanticism was not limited only to poetry, but it also affected the arts. And if you look at the musicians, you have Beethoven, who is an extremely important musician, who starts off as a classical musician and then later becomes what you call a romantic musician. And what is interesting about him is he dedicates a piece of music called the Emperor Concerto to a man called Napoleon, who we all know about, who is one of the people who comes up from the French Revolution. And what happens, unfortunately, is that when he rises to power and he declares himself as the emperor and he wants to be the emperor of the whole world, people who are very romantic minded, like Beethoven, get disappointed and disillusioned. Beethoven calls for a public kind of presentation of his Emperor Concerto, which he had dedicated to Napoleon, and he publicly tears up the dedication and throws it out. Now that was something extremely important for a little artist to do against a big emperor. We must remember that when you talk about an artist, the artist doesn't have the status that the artist has today. The artist was considered the same kind of person as a cook or a butler or a waiter, and very often the kings used to have the serving men, the cooks and the butlers and the waiters coming in and placing the food on their tables, and within a few minutes you would have the musicians coming in and playing their piece, or the musicians would play and go out by the same door that the cooks and butlers would come in. So the musicians didn't have a status. But it is around this time, called the age of Romanticism or the Romantic Age, that here you have the artist who comes up and asserts himself as an artist. The artist whose image or ego becomes tremendously important for him, so that he asserts himself. There is an incident from the life of Beethoven where the Archduke and his wife are walking through the garden, and another artist says to Beethoven, "Let us bow to them." And Beethoven says, "No. Now the time has come when they will have to bow to us because we are artists." Now this is a very interesting kind of moment in history, and when we study the history of Wordsworth and Coleridge, we must remember that this is the spirit of the whole age, which is something that informs the revolutionary spirit of what you call Romanticism. Now here we have two young people, Wordsworth and Coleridge. Wordsworth, or William Wordsworth as he called, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. William Wordsworth is again this aristocratic young man whose parents die very, very young, when he's about 5 or 9 or something of the sort. He has no real parents to look after him. He's got younger brothers and sisters, and what is interesting is he writes a huge tome of poetry which is called The Prelude. Now here you have these romantics who are so terribly bothered about the mind. They are bothered about the mind of children. They are what you call the first or the early or proto-psychologist, because psychology as a subject has not come up. But they are thinking about what is a mind, how does the mind work, how does a child's mind work, and how does a child construct himself. Now, this is something that we find in this prelude. But we also remember that he writes a number of poems which are about poor people. He writes the Lucy Gray poems, and the Lucy Gray poems are about a poor girl who is caught in the wild or is hiding alone, who is lost somewhere. Now those are poems which are terrible because they're talking about poverty and they're talking about poor people. We must remember that in today's world, which is what we call a post-Marxist world, we are talking about a set of two poets who were there before Marx, and they were already talking about poor people. And what is revolutionary about their poetry is that they think that writing about poor people is worthy or a worthy subject for poetry. Before them, nobody would have thought about writing about a poor person in a poem. No person would write a poem upon Westminster Bridge, which is a sonnet that Wordsworth writes. And he is talking about what we talk about today, that the environment is changing, the city is eating up the country, the city is eating up the plants, the city has got more and more buildings and more factories and less countryside or vegetation or wildlife or birds and bees and animals and cool kind of setting where people can take their own time to do things. We must remember that Wordsworth writes this poem, which is what you call the leech gatherer, where he's talking about a person who picks up leeches because leeches were important as a kind of medical treatment if you had any disease that they thought was caused by extra blood. So they would normally bleed a person and make the leeches suck the blood out of somebody. Now, a leech gatherer would normally work in marshlands. The leech gatherer is very much like all the poor little rag pickers that we find outside on our roads and streets who look into dustbins to find some little kind of rags which they can sell and make some money. The leech gatherer is a person who does exactly this. He is a person who picks up leeches and he gets a small wage. And Wordsworth writes a sonnet, a poem about the leech gatherer, which becomes extremely important for him. I think we know about his sonnets. He writes a number of sonnets, and upon Westminster Bridge is one of the early sonnets that he writes, which is a strange kind of sonnet because nobody has ever thought about writing a sonnet on a bridge about what is going on and how society is changing. But we must also remember that he writes The Solitary Reaper and The Daffodils, which are poems that are studied again and again in schools and in universities and colleges. Now, when we talk about a poem like The Daffodils, he's talking about imagination. He's talking about how imagination works, right? I think it might be important to remember there is this line in The Daffodils which says, "They flash upon the inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude." Right? "When oft upon my couch I lie, in pensive or in vacant mood, they flash upon the inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude." Now, we must remember that the poetic practice of Wordsworth and Coleridge comes very close to what they're talking about in their poems. So when he's talking about the the daffodils flashing upon the inward eye, they're talking about imagination. They're talking about what he would say in his prelude. He would talk about something called poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. Something that he gets from Goethe, from the idea of the romantic, where feeling becomes more important than thought. Now, he also is talking about the idea of poetry being recollected, okay? Recollected in tranquility, recollected in peace. So when you say they flash upon the inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, we're talking about imagination and memory working together and creating poetry. Now, these are some of the things that we might need to think about when we talk about Wordsworth, and when we talk about another poem of his called The Solitary Reaper, which I'm sure all of you have had some acquaintance with. You will find that he's talking about something that is far, far away, and he's talking about the Hebrides, and he's talking about a reaper or a person who's cutting the grass, who's cutting the crop, and she's singing to herself in an accent and in a language that nobody can understand, or at least he cannot understand, but we definitely know that she is a Scottish person because Hebrides are in Scotland. Now, what is interesting is, why does he take such a lot of trouble to find out about language and what language people use? So he is bothered about these things largely because at the same time the British or the Europeans are colonizing the world, and suddenly they're coming to know that here there are a number of languages. They come to know there is a language called Konkani. They come to know there's a language called Hindi. They come to know there's a language called Marathi and Gujarati and Sanskrit and all these other languages which they did not know about. And here they're trying to find out what is the origin of language. Does poetry come first, or does language come first? These are the problems that they dealt with, and for them the idea of poetry is something that is associated with language. And what Wordsworth says is that poetry is written in an ordinary language of people. Yeah? He is making a distinction between what you call poetic language and poetic diction. Now, poetic diction, according to Wordsworth, would belong to somebody who is writing in what you call the neoclassical age. That is the age before Wordsworth and Coleridge. That is the age of Dryden, of Pope, of Johnson, who write with very studied kind of meters. Very carefully they're writing their meters out. They clip off words because they do not fit into the rhyme scheme. And here we have Wordsworth and Coleridge who come up with a new kind of poetry which is called free verse and is not written in what you call meter. Right? Of course, when you look at them very carefully, you'll find that Wordsworth writes some very good sonnets, and so does Coleridge. But they also are masters of rhyme scheme, of syllables. Without that, we cannot really have great poetry written. I'm sure we know about the addiction of Coleridge to what you call opium, and I'm sure that we have heard a lot of stories that Coleridge perhaps conned himself or created himself, largely because he wanted to create this image of him being an opium addict, and that because he was an opium addict, he was influenced by opium, and he would get visions, and he would get dreams, and he would get all these kinds of great kinds of effects because he was an opium taker, and therefore he wrote his Kubla Khan under the influence of opium. But many Coleridge scholars have actually found out that he works very carefully with the rhyme schemes, with what you call the consonants and the assonance and the alliteration within Kubla Khan, and he's worked on it carefully, and the papers have been found. So we cannot really trust him or believe him, but what's important is that he comes up with ideas that are associated with imagination. For the Romantics, what was important is imagination. And if we have to characterize the Romantics, the most important symbol of the Romantics would be the plant growing from the ground. For Coleridge, imagination which is not grounded in reality or in nature is not imagination, but what you call fantasy. So for him, fantasy would be something that is unbridled imagination that is working its way in different ways all over the place without any grounding at all. Fantasy would be what you get in the fairy tales, what we get in science fiction, what we get in some of our myths. Okay, we have the Pushpak Viman, we have the flying carpet, we have Daedalus and Icarus, who keep flying with wax wings and fly right up to the heavens, and then the wings of Icarus melt and he falls into the sea. Now these are myths that we all have in different cultures, and we believe that these are what you call fantasies until of course somebody actually flies. But for Wordsworth and Coleridge, they are against something that is associated with city poetry. They are talking about rural poetry or the village life. For them, the village life is more important than the city life. For them, the village language or the rustic language is more important than the city language. For them, feeling is more important than thought. So we have a different kind of poetry that is written, and this kind of poetry is something that you find constantly in Wordsworth and Coleridge. Now Coleridge, as we know, and also Wordsworth, are people who write important treatises on what is poetry. Now the preface to Wordsworth and Coleridge's lyrical ballads is written by William Wordsworth, and some of the things that I said about poetry and the idea of who the poet is something that comes up in Wordsworth's preface to the lyrical ballads. You might hear of a person called M.H. Abrahams, who you have in your book on which we normally use in all undergraduate classes, called the Glossary of Literary Terms. Now M.H. Abrahams is interesting in as much as Abrahams is a person who has the idea of something called the mirror and the lamp. He talks about the poet initially in the classical period as a person who imitates, and by his imitation he is called a poet. When we have the lamp that comes up, what is interesting is that the poet becomes the lamp, or the poet is the one who gives out light, and because of his light things shine. He is not living in somebody else's reflected light. So I think that's where the distinction comes in when we talk about romantic poetry. We also have a concept which we call the romantic ego, where the ego or the self of the poet becomes so important, right? When we talk about Wordsworth's poetry or Coleridge's poetry, you constantly have a question of the I coming in. The music in my heart I bore, right? I wandered lonely as a cloud. These are things that we have in Wordsworth's poetry, and the I becomes so important because he is actually writing himself into the poem, at least in some way. When we talk about Coleridge too, we have a lot of his writings which are associated with the I, and what is interesting is that both these people also are people who are writing about what is poetry. Poetry, according to Coleridge, Coleridge is one of the people who writes what is called the Lyrical Ballads, which is a huge treatise on what you call poetry and how poetry works. And we must also remember that he respects Wordsworth as a poet, and at the same time he finds that some of the things that Wordsworth says is not quite reasonable because it is over romanticized, as we would call it today, but Coleridge doesn't use that word. He talks about how unfair Wordsworth is to the gypsies by saying that their life is glorified. So he is very critical about the kind of poetry that Wordsworth is writing, and unless one is really a critic, one cannot be a good poet. So we must remember that literature and poetry is a criticism of life and also a criticism of existing bodies and styles of literature, which is something that we have with Wordsworth and Coleridge. Besides all these kinds of things, I think it is important to remember that here you have Wordsworth and Coleridge who are bothered about the poor. This is something that Marx would take up much later. The Romantics are associated with all this kind of understanding of the poor people. They put the poor people into their poetry, and also we must remember that we have a discipline today called sociology, but it was in the Romantic age that you had people who were bothered about collecting stories from people, going out and getting all the grandmother's tales, as you have the Grimm brothers do, and documenting what is going on among different kinds of communities as far as the stories are concerned. When we look at Wordsworth's Solitary Reaper, we find again that here is what he is doing, taking a leaf out of the book of the Grimm brothers perhaps. What is important is to look and to see that here we have people who are taking the trouble to go out of the way to see how other people in other communities live. If we go to Wordsworth's poem, The Daffodils, what happens over here? We find that in The Daffodils, he is actually going off and talking about a Welsh saint. David in Welsh is Daffy, right? And Saint David is the patron of the Welsh people, and he has normally daffodils in his arms. So what he is doing over there when he's holding the daffodils, or when Wordsworth is talking about the daffodils, there is also this preoccupation with language. He's also talking about what is it to be other than English. The Welsh, as we know, are still a minority community and have a minority language. Not many people know Welsh. Scots is again in a similar kind of condition. Though, of course, we had Burns and other people who were writing in Scots a long, long ago. Now, when we talk about Wordsworth and Coleridge and their poetry, they actually change the way of writing poetry. When Wordsworth says the poet is a man among men, he is trying to say that the poets are not supernatural beings, but they're just ordinary human beings like you and I, and they have the ordinary powers of language which are used. So it is what they do with the language and how they use their imagination which become so important. Coleridge has a lot to say about the imagination. What is the imagination? What kinds of imagination we have? And he tries to create a kind of an understanding on what kind of imagination goes into poetry. Now he calls it the synesthetic imagination, right? He talks about different kinds of imagination that are used, and these are imaginations which become interesting for a lot of people today, because what is imagination and what is literature? Can we talk about literature without imagination? Now, just to conclude, I think what is important is when we talk about Wordsworth and Coleridge, they bring in a new energy to poetry. They are young people. They take a form like the ode and they use it to write poetry so that they can write in free verse. They take sonnets, but they don't make too much of it. They do not really try to force people to write sonnets, but they ask people to write in free verse. They are people who talk about the poor people. They're people who talk about people who are other than themselves. Just remember that Kubla Khan is associated with near India. Okay, so here you have the idea of people of other cultures, of other races, of other ways of behavior. These are things that are interesting to them. People who are rustic, people who are poor, people who are not city dwellers are again extremely important for people like Wordsworth and Coleridge. Now, these are some of the things that we need to say when we talk about their poems. And of course, we must remember that Wordsworth's Prelude is a long poem which is written again and again, and there are about 4 different versions of the same poem which become very interesting to study. Now, over here, we have a lot of delving into the minds of what is the mind of a child. How does the mind work? These are questions that are addressed in his poetry, and a lot of them are insights that we find much later, which we get in psychology too. So we have 2 interesting poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge, who are actually looking at the mind, who are actually looking at society, who are actually looking at language, who are actually looking at poetry, and who are actually trying to create a new kind of world which is against the establishment, which is against the order of society that existed before them. So they are bringing a great change into what is called poetry, and they're getting a great change into what you call who is a poet, how does a poet write, what does a poet write. All these things are absolutely revolutionary, and that's why we cannot forget Wordsworth and Coleridge. And with that, I would like to stop and thank you very much. Right? Yeah.
SANDHAN, All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.